Now, for over 3 decades, we always have heard about this great big massive Herschel Walker trade and how the Herschel Walker trade really made and shaped the Dallas Cowboys dynasty of the 90s. It's pointed to as that seminal moment for Jimmy Johnson, that he pulled off the heist of the century and the Vikings got robbed, and he was able to take this player, turn it into a bunch of draft pick capital that built the best team of the 1990s in the NFL. We all know the narrative. We've grown up hearing about it for years. You hear about it during the draft. You hear about it at random different times, just in general. People always point to, oh my God, the Herschel Walker trade. Like, it's even got its own Wikipedia page, the Herschel Walker trade. Like, that's how pervasive the legend and story, the narrative about the Herschel Walker trade that went down on October the 12th, 1989 is. And still persists to this day. And I will admit, for years, I bought into that narrative, even though I knew better, that the Herschel Walker trade was a significant moment, a significant turning point in what Jimmy Johnson was trying to do in Dallas that ultimately led to being able to build that team that won 3 championships in a 4-year stretch from 92 to 95. And in terms of the trade, there's no question it was a big trade. It's a notable trade in terms of the compensation given up for one player. The Minnesota Vikings got Herschel Walker, Dallas's 3rd round picks in 1990 and 1991. Ended up getting San Diego's 5th round pick in 1990 because the Cowboys had acquired Darren Nelson and he didn't want to go there. So the Cowboys sent Darren Nelson to San Diego, and then the Cowboys sent the 5th rounder to Minnesota, and they got Dallas's 10th round pick in 1990. So, yes, the Vikings got back Herschel Walker and very little else. They got some back, but ultimately, this trade is known for the Minnesota Vikings gave up a shit ton in order to bring in Herschel Walker because they thought they were a player away. And not only were they not a player away, Herschel Walker was a massive disappointment in his time in Minnesota, and he absolutely was. Meanwhile, for the Dallas Cowboys, they acquired a bunch of players, linebackers Jesse Solomon and David Howard, cornerback Isaac Holt, and defensive end Alex Stewart. And they got the Vikings' 1st, 2nd, and 6th round pick in 1990. And of course, you had the conditional 1st and 2nd round picks that were tied to whether or not the Cowboys kept these guys that were acquired in the trade or not, which Jimmy Johnson knew ultimately he wasn't going to do. Like, if you want to question anything about the Vikings, why would you attach such high draft pick capital or conditions for draft pick capital on such middling or even 3rd-tier players like you did? You know, you had the conditional 1991 1st round pick, conditional 1991 2nd round pick, conditional 1992 1st round pick, a 2nd round pick in 1992 that conveyed to the Cowboys with that Darren Nelson deal. The Vikings 1992 3rd round pick. Like, these are all things that conveyed in one way or another because of the players that came to the Dallas Cowboys. And I'm here to tell you, like, just because we've believed in things for years, many of us probably used to believe in Santa Claus when we were a kid. That doesn't make shit true. The notion that the Herschel Walker trade made the Cowboys dynasty is an NFL draft and, frankly, an NFL myth. I'm not saying it played absolutely no role, but the legendary status that this trade has taken on compared to the actual reality of what resulted for the Cowboys, they do not match. It is not even close, because when you look at the players that ultimately came out of this Herschel Walker deal for the Dallas Cowboys. Now, Holt ended up actually being a starter on one of the Super Bowl teams, so you could say he was there. But you had Emmitt Smith. That was a byproduct of some of the picks that they got when they moved up in 1990 to get to pick 17, trading with the Steelers to get Emmitt. Stan Smagala. It was a trade of the Vikings' 6th round pick in 1990. He played like 2 seasons for them, and he was gone by the time the Super Bowl years came. They parlayed the Vikings' 1st round pick in 91 to go get Russell Maryland 1st overall out of Miami. The U! They traded that 2nd round pick from the Vikings in 91 as part of a package to bring in Alonzo Highsmith, running back from the U! obviously via trade, but you get my point. And then they were able to leverage the Vikings' first-round pick in 1992 to do some maneuvering, and it led to them drafting Kevin Smith. You remember the old commercial from back in the mid-90s. This is how far back we go. Kevin Smith was the Gipper. Remember the old Dion commercial? Darren Woodson. So Clayton Holmes was a second-round pick. They got that from the Minnesota Vikings. So when you look at this, what should stand out to you is they got a couple of guys you hardly remember and a couple of pretty nice pieces. Emmitt Smith, first ballot Hall of Famer. Darren Woodson, one of those borderline Hall of Fame type of guys. Kevin Smith was a starter, but he wasn't a stud. Clayton Holmes was a depth type of guy, had periods where he started, but he certainly wasn't a stud in Dallas. Like this whole notion that this Herschel Walker trade was some bountiful boon for the Dallas Cowboys and the dynasty that Jimmy Johnson would ultimately go on to build in Dallas in the 90s is just total horse shit. It just doesn't match the reality. And I think sometimes it matches this larger kind of media narrative for a guy like Jimmy Johnson, you know, a Hall of Fame coach, and legitimately so, won championships at both the NCAA and NFL level. I cannot take away from that. But since Jimmy Johnson's been so media friendly over the years, since Jimmy Johnson's been a member of the media for 2.5+ damn decades, there's this certain desire, it feels like at times, to prop him up more than is really called for. And I know you'll have the draft heads that'll talk about the Jimmy Johnson draft chart and everything else. But let's put it this way. As good as the Cowboys' performance was in the draft in that late 80s, early 90s period, it was far from perfect. Keep in mind that this is the same damn Jimmy Johnson that utilized a first-round supplemental draft pick in 1989 on Steve Walsh, his quarterback from where, you guessed it, the U, when they had just already drafted Troy Aikman, number 1 overall in the regular draft. What does that mean? That means in 1990, the pick that they had for going 1-15 in the 89 season, that would have been number 1 overall, they didn't have. Just imagine for a second, if Jimmy Johnson didn't make one of the most boneheaded draft decisions ever and give up the number 1 overall pick for Steve Walsh. You want to talk about draft bust, and you want to talk about stupidest draft moves of all time. Jimmy Johnson giving up a supplemental first-round pick, which then translated into the number 1 overall pick for what was going to always be a backup quarterback, is one of the single most idiotic things ever. An example of at times how Jimmy Johnson couldn't remove himself and his loyalty to his players from the U. Just imagine if they had that number 1 overall pick in 1990. They could have conveyed that into a significantly more draft pick capital, as maybe the Colts still would have moved up to try and get Jeff George. Or maybe they would have sat there at number 1. Now maybe they would have freaked out and went Blair Thomas, and then who knows what the hell would have happened. You wouldn't have taken Emmitt Smith, that's for sure. But imagine if they took Junior Seau, who went 5th overall in that year to San Diego out of USC. Or Cortez Kennedy, the Hall of Fame defensive tackle, 3rd overall, went to Seattle from the U. Think about that. That's what Jimmy Johnson gave up. This is the guy that people do backflips to praise. There was lots of reasons to praise him. But there are absolutely things that you can do to criticize him too, because his resume is far from spotless. And even when you want to point to the Herschel Walker trade and say, well, it led to the ability to be able to be flexible and move up in 1990 to go take Emmitt Smith 17 overall. You really think that Emmitt Smith was their first choice? Ding dong, dumb dicks. They fancied James Francis. And if you thought that their target was almost Emmitt Smith, that is always Emmitt Smith. It was revisionist history of the utmost. If they so badly wanted Emmitt Smith, they wouldn't have given up a 2nd-round pick to trade for an Alonzo Highsmith. They wouldn't have given up a 2nd and 3rd-round pick for a Terrence Flagler, who was a former failed 1st-round pick from the San Francisco 49ers. They got fortunate and lucky that they didn't outmaneuver and outthink themselves when they took Emmitt Smith. He certainly was not their first choice. He certainly was not the player that they had to have no matter what. Don't believe anything that anybody tells you that runs counter to that, because it's not true. So just Keep it in mind, Alonzo Highsmith was gone after 1991. Same for Smagala. Russell Maryland was good, but he certainly wasn't Hall of Fame level, and he certainly was the wrong Miami defensive tackle to take in the wrong year. Like, imagine if they took Cortez Kennedy in 1990. Holy shit, how much better could that Dynasty team have been? And again, the Emmitt Smith, they wanted James Francis, the linebacker from Baylor. I mean, good Lord. And even if you want to say, well, one of the picks became Kevin Smith, that's fine. But even then, they drafted Kevin Smith over who ended up being a superior player, a very superior player in Dale Carter. So when you look at the way this whole Herschel Walker trade played out for the Dallas Cowboys, here's what it ultimately resulted in. One offensive starter on that first Super Bowl team under Jimmy in 92. That was Emmitt. That came from that Walker trade. 2 defensive starters. That's it. 2. 3 defensive starters by the time you got to the 93 championship team. That was Russell Maryland, Darrell Woodson, and Kevin Smith. 2 defensive starters by the time you got to the 95 championship team with Russell Maryland and Darren Woodson. And that's it. 1 offensive starter, a couple of defensive starters. Last time I checked, does not a team make. So I ask you, how could anybody with a straight face actually look at the historical evidence and point to the Herschel Walker trade being the seminal moment that led to the creation of the Dallas Cowboys dynasty of the 1990s? It didn't. That makes no fucking sense. What made the Dallas Cowboys dynasty of the 1990s was the fact that you had Jim Jeffcoat and Mark Tuinei left over from that great 1983 draft class. You had Kevin Gogan from the 87 draft. In that 1988 draft, which was still when Tom Landry and Tex Schramm were all there, you had Michael Irvin and Ken Norton Jr. and Chad Hennings. Those guys were all part of that draft class. And they were guys that were key cogs in the machine at different points in time, obviously, during that freaking dynasty run. And Irvin's in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. The 1989 draft, Jimmy's first year there, his first draft. Troy Aikman, Daryl Moose Johnston, Mark Stepnoski, Tony Tolbert. These are all guys, Troy Aikman in the Hall of Fame. So you had multiple Hall of Famers in the mix before you ever even got to the Herschel Walker fucking trade. And several other key cogs. And then you look at the 91 draft and some of the other players that they took that weren't related to draft picks related to the Herschel Walker deal. Alvin Harper, Dixon Edwards, Godfrey Miles, Eric Williams, Leon Lett, Larry Brown was a 12th round pick. That was a great draft class. It was a great draft class. Russell Maryland wasn't even the best player in that draft class for them. I'd argue he wasn't even the second best player in that draft class for them. 1992 draft class, Robert Jones. 1993 draft class, brought him Darren Smith and Brock Marion. And then you talk about bringing in the guys like the Charles Haley's in free agency. Yeah, I could go on and on and on. But to sit there and tell me that the Herschel Walker trade was the moment is ridiculous. See, sure, it played a role. They got Emmitt Smith out of it. If you said, bar none, if this was just a 1-for-1 deal and you said they traded away Herschel Walker for 1 draft pick that became Emmitt Smith, then you would say that was a massive win for the Dallas Cowboys, as it absolutely was. And sure, they got other pieces out of this. But the way they act was that they built this uber team of all time from the draft picks, the draft capital that came out of dealing Herschel Walker, which is false, phony baloney bullshit. You already had key cogs in place before Jimmy Johnson even got there, inheriting the number 1 overall pick in the 89 draft, taking Aikman. Like, it's astounding to me how many years I fell for this narrative and how many years I fell for this crap. Do a lot of you believe this? Have I opened your eyes at all? This is not to say again that the Herschel Walker trade played no role whatsoever in making that Cowboys great dynasty of the 90s. What this is saying, and what it is arguing, I feel effectively, is that the level that this holds in the pantheon of NFL history, this Herschel Walker trade, is massively, massively overblown.